Awesome. Thanks for coming to our workshop on full stack development with NX and Bazel. I'm Alex. I work on the Angular team at Google.
I'm Tor. I work for Narwhal.
And we've been working together on this stuff for, I guess, about a year. It's really awesome to be in front of you and force you to do it too. So I work on this thing called Angular Build Tools Convergence, which is under Angular Labs. You'll see this little logo up here in the corner. This means don't use this for production yet. I'll put this link again at the end, but this is the short link for this build tools thing that we're working on. Tor works at Narwhal and supports enterprise Angular users who have who need better integration of all the tools that they have to do their jobs. And so it just makes sense for us to be working together on this because I'm trying to make the way that Google does development available, and Narwhal is trying to help enterprises do things sometimes the way Google does. Yeah. OK, so we'll spend a little bit of time. I'm just going to give an overview of Bazel. How many people have already know something about it? And how many people have used it already? OK, very good. So there are other talks, which I'll reference, but I'll just spend a little bit of time on that. And then we're actually going to use our laptops and run an app, and we'll make some changes, and we'll see what the development workflow looks like. So for that part, we're going to use this repo. And although I'm going to talk for a while, go ahead and open this URL and have this available for later. So there's a README here that has some instructions. And there are a couple of ways that you can set this up. So the first way is you could install Bazel locally on your Mac or Linux. Bazel does work on Windows, but some of the stuff we're going to show today doesn't yet work on Windows. However, there are probably too many people for us all to do this on the Wi-Fi because there are a couple hundred megabytes of toolchain that we're going to be using underneath since we're doing full stack. So please be aware of that, and if you're still downloading after several minutes and it's really slow, there's a better option. Thanks to rhyme.com, and a friend of the Angular team, Minko Getchev, works at this company, and this is his product he works on. This is going to give you a VM that you can just open in your browser, and the VM is already has all of the stuff set up and ready to go. So that's probably the most convenient thing to do. However, even more convenient than that is find somebody else who has something working, like pair up with a buddy nearby. And you'll probably be able to learn from each other anyway. And even easier than that is you can just watch Tor do the things up front. However, there's a catch. If you choose option number 4, you can't have this shirt. So the reason to do the setup is if you run Bazel, you get a T-shirt, at least while supplies last. So we have shirts up here at the end. Assuming that you've run Bazel, we're going to do honor system. Please come and get a shirt. And there are a lot of women's shirts, I'm being told by my lovely assistant. So the next 10 minutes I'm going to be talking, but you can go ahead and use your laptop. I know normally during a talk you would all close your laptops. So go ahead and go to this URL. There's some instructions there. So you should be able to go onto this onto the VM on rhyme.com and you can just leave it sitting there. So Angular Build Tools Convergence. The basic idea here is that I started working on the Google internal toolchain for building Angular apps because I've done Google internal tooling for quite a while. And at the same time, we were developing a toolchain for you to use in open source land. And they're not the same, and it makes me sad. Because the stuff I'm working on, you don't all get to use. And we end up doing a lot of work twice. And the Angular team has a lot more support burden because there are so many different ways of doing things. So what if we could make the bubbles overlap somewhat? And they're never going to be the same. But what if we could both move Google towards you so that the stuff that we've been working on is open source and works in your ecosystem, and at the same time try to bring some of the open source stuff into Google so that through a combination of those two things, there's more overlap. So we benefit, and hopefully you benefit. And then I get happy. So I like working on this stuff. That's cool. So generally, the scope of the project is anything developer productivity related. We have a lot of developer tools at Google. I think some of them are super cool. This is more stuff than I will get to in a lifetime. Probably. I don't know. Maybe this will be a medical breakthrough. So we're going to talk about this build tool, which is just this bubble here. And our build tool is called Bazel. And so that's what we're going to be using, and that's what's on the shirts. Importantly, there are arrows that connect Bazel to other parts of the toolchain. And so depending on how well this thing goes being in Angular Labs, if it gets promoted more, then we probably will start working on some of those other arrows to give you some of the things that are related to it. So we use Bazel at Google for every Angular app we build. We also now use it to build Angular itself. There are a lot of good things, I think, about Bazel. So if I had to give you 3 bullets, which I didn't have to, but that sounded like a good number. Number 1, it stays fast as you scale up, both a large code base and a large number of developers. You can customize it. You can have your build is special without having a giant configuration explosion. And it's full stack, which we're going to go dive into today. So I'm basically just going to reference other talks for these parts because we don't have time. So working well at scale, watch Rado's talk from Angular Connect last year. He talked about incrementality and this very simple concept that right now, every time you do a build, you're doing the whole build. And you only changed one thing. So that just seems obviously silly. You should only rebuild the thing you changed. Ideally, it's fine-grained enough that there's really only a tiny amount of work to do when you make a change to get your app back up to date again. The other thing that's silly is that you have a computer, and then does it have 125 terabytes of RAM? Jeff, that's your line.
What computer has that much RAM?
Yeah, so what you really should do is have a farm of machines that you can bring up. And so especially if you're doing an initial build, you have a really big project, and like we're going to talk about today, it has a front end and a back end. There's a lot of stuff to build. It takes a long time, and people are they have the XKCD cartoon in mind when they're sword fighting on their office chairs because they're waiting for the compile. So at Google, we rely heavily on, obviously on the incrementality, but also on being able to execute remotely and then getting cache hits from the remote execution. So if your CI has already built at head, and then you come along later in the day and you want to do a build at head, you should just be able to download the artifacts. You shouldn't have to redo the build. I'm not really going to talk about customization because Greg, my coworker on the ABC team, is going to give this talk at 5:30. So if you all have the stamina to make it that long, definitely check this out. Basic idea is today you have kind of the choice between Angular CLI does it all for you, but it does it only one way, or if you want to do it your own way, you have you're handed all of the configuration files, and you no longer have the CLI experience. So we think that Bazel can be part of fixing that and making it possible to have a customized build without all that configuration. So check out his talk. And now we can get to today, which is what's good about doing full stack development with Bazel. So first of all, how many people work both on front end and back end stuff? Okay, cool. So this is the right audience. Wait, don't put your hands down. Okay, so now if the back end system you work on is not on this list, then put your hand down. Okay. Cool. So these are the people who could potentially be making use of Bazel because your backend is here and your front end now builds with Bazel also. And so there are basically, I'm going to give you four things to think about why you want to do this. Number 1, today you're probably using 2 different build systems if you do front end and back end work. And that's super annoying. It's a big context switch. Build systems tend to be kind of leaky abstractions, so you kind of have to understand how they work somewhat. You're like, oh, I have to rebuild this thing before I rebuild that thing. So it's really handy to be able to use the same configuration file format to make all of your different pieces of the build work. The other thing that is very common, especially in enterprises, is that you'll kind of accidentally acquire a lot of different technologies in your stack. So somebody wrote some Ruby wrapper around something, and you ended up relying on it, and you would rewrite it in your other backend language, but nobody has time. So you end up with kind of a lot of different pieces, and that diversity makes it hard for you as a developer to interact with the build tools. And so now you just it's always just Bazel build something regardless of what it's written in. The next one is that you want to be able to write tests, and you want to be able to make a change and run all of the tests. And those tests should include, I made a change to the backend and it broke the front end. And so it's really nice to be able to write one test that says my integration test, and it brings up the front end and the back end, and it makes sure they work, and they're both built from head, and there's and you know that you're getting the same thing on CI also. And the fourth thing, which we're going to definitely experience today, is that you get the benefits of type checking and generally the things that the build system does across the boundary of the front end and the back end. So you know that you make a change here and it still works there, but you also, as you're typing, you can say, oh yeah, this is the thing that my data, this is what I'm going to get back from the server when I make this API call, and so I know that I'm making the right thing here. Cool. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk about 2 specific file formats because we're going to encounter those once you start doing some coding. The first one is this build.bazel file, and this is the configuration that Bazel needs to know what to do. The thing that you put in this configuration file, so like I said, you can see in the repo that we pointed you to already. There's a Java server that has a build file. There's an Angular project that has a build file. So it's the same thing everywhere. What they do is they describe your inputs and what your dependencies are, and dependencies are kind of another form of inputs, and that's it. They don't say what to do. There's nothing in there that says what order to do things in. That's all Bazel's job to figure out. When it sees these files, it constructs a partial ordering constraint, and then it makes a graph, and then it figures out which things need to be rerun. It makes another graph of actions it's going to rerun. You don't need to know any of that stuff. And there's going to be more detail about how these build files interact with each other, again, in Greg's talk later. So I'm just going to show this one example. So this is called ng-module. We use this to build Angular itself, and you also use it to build Angular libraries. We also use this internally at Google. This is exactly the same code that every Googler runs to build Angular code. And it's just a wrapper around the ngc command tool that's Bazel aware. So it just adapts the two. And I'll quickly run through the semantics of this file. The first line is calling this function called ng-module. When you call, and that's called a rule, which is just a word for a plugin in Bazel. So we have this plugin that we wrote. And then by calling this, we're going to generate a target called app. And you've probably, if you've used like Gulp or Grunt, you're familiar with this notion of a target is something you can type and like, I want to build this thing. So under Bazel, every single rule, every one of these little chunks of configuration is individually addressable, and you can build it or test it or run it or whatever you want to do. So these are obviously we have to hand some TypeScript sources to ngc, the Angular compiler, and we handed the templates and the styles. And then importantly, these deps at the bottom are things that it depends on. And you'll see in a little bit, this first one of these deps is our car TS proto, which comes from libs API. This is the API definition that the server and the client share. So we clearly depend on that. And then also interesting, we depend on RxJS. But since RxJS publishes Bazel build files in their source distribution, we can compile it from head. So we're actually going to compile RxJS. We're not going to use their node package because like more of the pieces can start to fall inside the ecosystem. You know, maybe in 20 years, everything will be Bazel. Probably not. I don't have that much time. The other thing we're going to use today is protocol buffers. So you don't have to use protocol buffers. We could be using like Swagger or some other API definition. This happens to be something we use a lot at Google. And we use this for all of our wire format. And it's very cross-language, and it has really good characteristics of forwards and backwards compatibility and really small size on the wire. And so it's basically, you know, most Google engineers, we joke, spend about 80% of their time marshalling and unmarshalling protocol buffers and then like handing the fields from one to another. So this is an example of what it looks like. This is our car definition. Pretty simple. Like there's just not much text here. This is actually a protocol buffer definition that you're going to be working on. So I'm going to hand it to Tor now to talk specifically about the part of this that Narwhal contributes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Before we start, how many of you already know NX? Quite a few people. In case you're not familiar with NX, it's essentially a set of extensions on top of the Angular CLI. And the goal of NX is to be helpful if you're creating like a large enterprise application. And it turns out that Bazel fits nicely into this picture. We've added some early support into NX to create kind of Bazel-ready workspaces. So if you're familiar with NX, you might know this command, create NX workspace. And the only thing that's different from the default command is that we have this -- Bazel flag on the end. And if you run this command, you get a Bazel-enabled workspace. And Dan wrote a great blog post that we've linked to here with more examples of how to set up an NX workspace from scratch. So a little bit about today's coding exercise. We want this to be kind of like a hands-on experience. So we've created a repo that Alex shared with an NX Bazel workspace. It's a relatively simple app. It's a list of luxury cars, but it has an Angular front end and a Java back end. And as Alex mentioned, we're using the protocol buffers, which is essentially how we share typings between the back end and the front end. And as Alex pointed out, the disclaimer is that this is prototype quality code. Please play with it and give us feedback, but don't jump into production just yet.
Did any of you notice Dan and I last night were like trying to fix this in the lobby? Yeah, it's definitely prototype.
Yeah, it didn't end there. We actually worked till the morning, right?
Not all night.
Well, not all night, but we still had work to do in the morning. So, okay. And like I said, we want this to be kind of hands-on. And so we're lucky to have some Bazel experts here to kind of help you out if you get stuck. We have Dan and we have Greg. They're, really, they have been instrumental to this whole Bazel Angular process. So they'll be more than helpful. So thanks to Dan and Greg. And okay, so did everyone kind of start the process of installing and pulling down the repo?
Or just use or click through
Yeah.
to sign into the VM.
Yeah. Was it clear? Were the instructions clear? Like,
Okay.
anyone having issues? What's that? Oh, you're still npm installing? Okay. Yeah, so maybe it's better to try the VM that Rime and Minko provided. You can try that. Because the first milestone is really just get the app up and running. And when you have all the dependencies installed, you run npm run start and navigate in a browser to localhost 5432. And we'll give folks a couple of minutes to get up to that stage.
Does that querying step when you run that, is that going external too, or is that all local to the package?
Well, yeah, it's downloading stuff while that's running for the first time. That's why that is a slow process the first time. But you'll notice once it's up and running, if you kill it and restart it, it won't be as slow.
Okay, cool.
So you'll be kind of hurt by the network slowness there.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Like on the VM, we already ran it for you, so you kind of one step closer to having it up and running.
It's running now. So.
What's that? It's not connecting to the VM. Oh, I said just spinning saying connecting? Okay, is anyone else able to connect?
Some people are on.
Okay.
Okay. Like I said earlier, if your thing is having trouble and one of your neighbors is working, that still counts.
Yeah, that might be the best thing. And you can try this at home when you're on a faster network. Hopefully, the instructions are clear enough to where you can give it a shot at home.
Let me point out another thing. So assuming that your dev server is running, you probably see a lot of ugly-looking output on the terminal. So what we're trying to do is, in a single command, run two different servers, right? The Java server and the front-end server. Typically, I see people do this in two different terminals, so that you have separate output from the two things, and they don't collide with each other. We just wanted to make this workshop a little bit simpler, so we're using concurrently, which is an npm package, to just run the two processes at the same time. But what happens is Bazel is actually a client-server architecture, and so the two processes are kind of like fighting over this lock. And so you'll just see a bunch of output with them. Each one of them is like, oh, the other guy's doing something now. And yeah, try not to be put off by how rough it is. Just imagine how great it will be.
And this is what you will see once it's up and running. Very simple application. List of, I guess we use the term luxury cars loosely here. We have Honda Civic of 2008, but it's going to be part of your task to change that to more.
Yeah, exactly. You should fix whichever cars here you don't feel like are luxury cars. You'll be up to you to fix that.
But the important part is that the list of cars is actually returned from a Java API in the form of JSON.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
Can we get the links?
Oh, yeah.
No, I should let you do it.
Oh, sorry. Where was that slide again?
There was a second link to it just a couple of slides ago. Okay, so it's at the bottom of this one.
Yeah, the README in that repo should have the up-to-date instructions. Yeah. How many were able to get the VM up and running? Okay, so quite a few. So I think at this point, if you can't get it to work, maybe join a neighbor or a friend and has to be at least above 6.
So, well, okay, so the question from the audience is what version of Node are we using? So actually, one of the advantages of Bazel is that as much as possible, Bazel is in charge of installing all of the tool chains. And if you're a full stack developer and you started from backend, you don't know what Node and NVM and NPM and Yarn, and you don't know which one to use. So one of the advantages here is that you should not even need those things installed on your machine. You just need Bazel. We're still working through a couple of bugs where it does leak through and try to find the local install of Yarn. But that's basically the idea. So you don't need to know which version of Node is involved. And for this demo, we're telling you to do npm run something, so that clearly is using the one on the machine.
Yeah.
There are obviously trade-offs about which tool chain to expose and what people are used to. And if you're bored, by the way, we put these boxes at the bottom with like an extra challenge.
Yeah.
So, you can try to run the Bazel command that just builds one of the things.
All right, should we move on to the next one, or should we give people 5 minutes?
We have another question from an audience member. So what error do you have? Oh, okay, yes. So iBazel is the watch mode for Bazel. If you're using the VM, it should just be there.
Yeah, it should be in package.json for the NX.
So there is a warning, which is my fault, that when you run this thing, it says, it looks like iBazel wasn't installed locally, but it is installed locally. It's looking in the wrong place. Given more time, we would have polished up the UI for this a little bit more. Okay.
Okay. Should we move on, or? Okay. And you can just come to the normal booth tomorrow or maybe later tonight, and we can, if you have questions, we can try to sort things out. Okay. So the next milestone is we want to make a modest update to the template, one of the templates, just to see that the rebuild will be triggered by Bazel, and you'll see the change in the browser. So just go to app component HTML and change the h1 tag to something else. Yeah.
We didn't mention, by the way, I'm not sure if when the VM came up, if Visual Studio Code was already there, but it is installed. So you can click the little icon in the upper left to get all the packages, or if you're on the command line, you can do code space dot. Don't try to edit from the command line; it would probably suck. So yeah, Visual Studio Code is on this machine.
So what you should see is, as soon as you hit save, it should trigger a build, and you should see an updated UI based on whatever change you made. So just make a trivial change just to see that your system is actually responding to and watching the files appropriately.
This is the step, by the way, that no matter how big your app is, the objective of this project is that it should never be longer than 2 seconds to see your change show up in the browser. So the VM that we're on is slow, and we still have some more work to do on performance. But one of the things that Greg has worked on is a benchmarking suite, so we can actually keep track of what the development round trip time is. And so that's what you should expect. If that's not happening today, then have a free t-shirt. Sorry, localhost 5432.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, here's the URL, 5432.
Do you want to do another demo of changing the sources?
Yeah.
For anybody whose thing is not working, you can just see it up here on the screen.
Yeah, okay, I should. So essentially, I just updated that text. And then you can see it re-triggered. It's compiling only that changed module, not everything else. And then, there you go. And if you finish early, you can experiment with changing other files, like the TS file, because it will watch and rebuild those as well.
There's a lot of code in that repo for you to modify.
So was anyone able to get this to work?
Cool.
Oh, that's good. And most of you are on the VM, or? Oh, that's
It
awesome.
worked.
Thanks, Minko.
Yes, please.
What would be like the best way to run like which server? I need to build like a
So you mean for production serving, right? So you mean for production deployment, right? So the question is like how does this relate to the way your users would interact with your site, basically? Like, how would you get this code out there? So what we're showing you here is a dev server, and it's actually written in Go, but you didn't notice. The Go toolchain was automatically downloaded by Bazel. The reason it's written in Go is that we've done a bunch of like micro optimizations so that the dev server can reload even 10,000 files in like 200 milliseconds, because we have a lot of Google apps that do that. So the dev server you're using is completely different from what you would do in production, at least as far as the serving architecture, right? This is using AOT, so it's the same JavaScript code you would serve to your users. If you're going to productionize this, number one, there's a Bazel rule in this repository, which is the prod server, and instead of this server, it runs, I think, HTTP server or history server. It runs like one of your standard node like backends, but you could also serve it from anything under Bazel. And then, of course, you would do a packaging step when it's time to release. Bazel would not be at all related to what you're hosting on cloud, unless you had a cloud provider that had some sort of continuous integration, continuous delivery built in. But typically, what we do on the Angular team, for example, is when it's time to do a release, we just say Bazel build. Basically, we give it a pattern that expands to all of our NPM packages, and it builds all of our NPM packages. And then we actually do Bazel run like core npm package.publish. And then that's what sends it out to be live. So we just do a Bazel run command that's a publish, and you could do the same thing to publish it to your whatever you use for production hosting.
Okay. Are we good with this? Ready to move on? Cool. All right, so the next, so like we said, the car selection is less than impressive. So what we want you to do next is to change the response to add additional cars that you think are more impressive. And where you need to make those edits is under backend source and car servlet.java. And in there, you'll see an array of car objects. Just pop in another car object.
I can't wait to see the tweets where people say they went to ng-conf and they were told to edit Java code.
All right.
We don't want to admit it, but we do have to work in other languages.
All right. And also, when you hit save in that file, just watch what the browser does.
So I want to make another performance qualification here. So iBazel is similar to the tool we use internally. Internally, we have an extra feature that's not yet open sourced, which is that it does JVM hot swap, which is a clever way in Java of basically doing like hot module reload would be for Webpack, where it recompiles, makes a new jar file, and then that's loaded into the running server without restarting. So that's cool, and that would make this faster. Since that's not available, what happens is this Java server, after the recompilation, it just restarts itself. And then I think we'd have like some retry logic in the API layer so that it like picks back up again when the server is live. Yeah. Yes. So actually, the link I showed earlier, which is g.co/ng/abc. If you scroll down, there's like a long list of conferences, and the slides are like the next to last one there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Which link was it?
Yeah. Let's just keep going up. I mean, I could show it at the end, but then we'd be giving something away probably. Okay, yeah, so the slides are already linked from the end of here. Yeah. We should have put that in the README too.
Yeah.
Maybe next time we do this workshop. Never doing this workshop. We'll take the video from this one and we'll just play it on loop.
Okay.
And again, if you have extra time, there's a box here. You could try, see if you can add another method to the Java class. You can try calling it.
Did anyone successfully complete this? Wow. It's much faster than I thought it would.
It's all on this side of the room. Maybe the Wi-Fi is faster over here. The router's on that side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what's the magic? So actually, I'm not sure what the last step of the magic is. Maybe Dan will have to fill us in the end. I mean, so the first thing that happens is we're running iBazel, which is a watch mode. And Bazel doesn't care what language you're in because it's full stack. So when the Java file changed, that was one of the files that iBazel is watching. And so it just told Bazel, hey, rebuild this jar. And then the jar gets packaged into a war. Then the war gets pushed into an app engine binary. And we're using the app engine dev server. But actually, it ends up getting restarted because it's being run by Bazel, but Bazel doesn't yet know how to hot swap the code. So that restarts. And then the client is always pinging.
Yeah, last magic because we don't have like a server that's hot swappable, and we wanted to make it so that our client refreshed when the server does. What I do is we make the server a data dependency of the client, which basically just means when the server changes, Bazel knows that it needs to kick off rebuilding the client again. It's just a small hack because things are still sort of progressing in Bazel world. So basically, when the server changes, the client gets rebuilt, and then it tries to refresh from the newly reinstantiated server, and you get your new data.
It's probably that's not realistic for what you would really do because you wouldn't want the web page to refresh if there's new data available. You would expect to have to do a reload or something. Yeah, usually live reload applies when the web application has changed, not when the data source has changed.
But it's actually rebuilding any client necessarily just in case because there's a dependency.
Yeah, so what Dan was saying is that there's a dependency edge that's kind of artificial between the Java server and the Angular app, just so that Bazel will know that the Angular app needs to be bumped whenever the Java server comes back up. But I mean, it's cool that these affordances are all there in Bazel, right? So there's a bunch of different ways we could do it. We could do it some good ways or some hacky ways. You still have a Honda Civic on your store.
I know. I think Dan added that, so
That's my car.
yeah, that's what I assumed.
Her name is Civic Jessica Parker. I would prefer she remains on.
Yeah, I assume so. So, but I made a modest improvement by adding my car, the Honda CR-V.
Okay, so again, oh yeah, one question. So the question is, what servers are supported? So we picked App Engine. I don't know why we picked App Engine, because we like.
Yeah, it
We like
basically
cloud?
there are a lot of samples online on the Bazel website, and they featured those rules. So it was just easier to get that in there. We tried to get a .NET sample as well, but the rules weren't as complete. We couldn't get it working. But hopefully next time it'll be possible.
So one way to think of Bazel is it has this graph, but then it just runs whatever process you say. And that process just has to be some tool. It has to be built by some tool chain that it downloads, and then it has to run. It just runs whatever process. So there's no limitation about what kind of server you could run. Once you get into like hot swapping and stuff, then you might need to have a little bit more of an interaction between the build tool and the server. By the way, another option is you could have Bazel just build the stuff and then point a server that you run outside of Bazel at the output folder. It's not as nice because now it doesn't know when to rebuild, right? You no longer have your graph is truncated at this boundary, and so the stuff on the other side it's not incremental anymore. But you could do that. You could just have Bazel's job is just to build the bundles, and then my server is external. And by the way, I have on Medium I have a blog post showing how to make a change to an Angular app, and then it live deploys to Kubernetes engine, which is extra cool because Docker also has this sort of incremental property of having layers of file systems. So that one's cool because it just updates the layer that was changed, and then so it just does a small push to the servers, and like 20 seconds later, you're live on production fleet. Yeah. So the question is, if you're using Firebase functions as a simple backend, can Bazel deploy your code changes there on the fly? And I haven't seen anybody wire that up. That sounds like a great science experiment. The only question to me is sort of ergonomics about like how the user would do that. So like for my Kubernetes example, you're doing Bazel run my thing.deploy, or sorry, iBazel run my thing.deploy, so it reruns it every time it changes. So you could certainly do something where you do iBazel run my Firebase deploy, and then every time there's a change, it'll redo the deploy. I see. So you could have several different targets. Although, I mean, Bazel will only run one target at a time, so you would probably have to have some external like task runner that coordinates, like run these several things in a row. So there might be a little bit of scripting around it with a loop. Although, I mean, that's also not, I mean, you certainly could do the loop inside of Bazel too, but you would just have to write more Bazel rules that understands multiple Firebase functions. That would be totally cool, yeah. Yeah, Kyle.
So this reminds me of the old days a little bit, back when we had make. We had things like automatic incremental rebuilds. And the insights, I'm like, why that all went away? And why we come back?
So the question is, why have you not all been using make all this time? It was there and it worked. Sorry. The question is, what are the insights about why we forgot the lessons for make and we had to, yeah. I'm not a JavaScript expert, so I don't know. But I think it may come from like, you know, we didn't used to have build tooling in JavaScript land. You would just change your files and refresh in the browser, and then we started introducing type checkers and transpilation and Babel and TypeScript, and so now you needed something to run it, but the simple thing to think about was, oh, so I just need this transformation as the file comes from the disk to the browser, so I just need some like loader in my server to do that. So it's easy to think about the small problem, and then when you actually have a complicated graph of things to do on every refresh, then that system doesn't scale as well. So I don't know. How many people have used make before? Oh, it's like a third. That's awesome.
Okay, so how did that go? People are almost done?
Raise your hand if your Java API change had effect.
Okay, so we can quickly show what we did. We just went into the car servlet Java file, added in another object, just similar to how the other ones are, and then this whole builder chain, we just called add cars and dropped in the new object. And that's pretty much all you have to do.
Okay.
Good? Right.
Now it's for the best part.
Yeah, now it gets even more interesting. So, all right. Oh no, I think we're, right. So now we want to, so far we only had 3 properties on that car object. Let's add a new one for color. So basically just go in and extend the proto object to have an additional property, kind of follow the pattern that's in there. And it's basically the car.proto under libs API src. And just follow the same convention that's in there with the incremental ID. Doesn't matter, like just put it at the end and increment the number by 1. And we also want to ferry that property through to the UI so that the list also displays the color now.
The Java API doesn't have type checking, does it? In VS Code, the Java API won't type check. Only on the command line.
But we deserialize it to the.
So while you're doing that, you could try making a mistake and see what happens, because both the front end and the back end should be bound by this API definition. So if you use the wrong type, if you misspell the name, you can see what happens. Again, we're multiplexing both of the dev servers onto the same terminal, and so you may have to like scroll up a while to see the mistake in the TypeScript code. Fortunately, that one should just show up in the editor. The editor should see the new DTS file generated from the protocol buffer. So your TypeScript code should understand what the new API definition is.
Yeah. And if you want, you could run this in 2 terminals, one for the Java API and one for the UI. We just figured it'd be easier for demo purposes to just combine them.
Yeah.
Obviously, the price you pay is a lot more output in the console.
So if you do want to do that, by the way, just look in the package JSON, right, for where the run script is, or start. So whatever we do in start, it says concurrently and then it has 2 commands. So just try taking those 2 commands out and you could run them separately. Yeah, question. Oh, that's a good question. So what if you use GraphQL to describe your schema? I don't actually know, but maybe somebody else can answer. I assume GraphQL does generate TypeScript typings. So it's at runtime you can ask what types the API has? So that makes it hard at design time to have a red squiggly in the editor that says you misspelled it, right? I'm sure somebody in the community has taken the GraphQL definition language and found a way to generate an equivalent TypeScript typings for it. Yes? Yes? Okay, yes, that exists. I don't know about generating like a Java jar file that has the interfaces to make, in theory, if you're going to use one of these data interop formats, you need a generator for every language that gives you an API to interact with, right? And it's not just type checking. It's also, in theory, like the Java thing we're using here has a builder pattern, and the protocol buffers are actually immutable, which is kind of it's a useful property. And so in each of the language libraries, there's some thought about like what's the idiomatic way in this language to express the API of like this data object. And in JavaScript, obviously, the easy way is just like a raw object, and you can mutate its fields. But you could imagine, for example, this protocol buffer thing we've generated, it could give you immutable JS, and that might be actually useful so that you can treat your data, so that you can take these data structures and not have to do the change detection in Angular. It could be based on them being immutable and always knowing you have the, to do it reactive style, basically. Anybody done it yet? Yes, 2. First 2 finishers. Okay, 5.
And one thing, once you have this working, just as an experiment, try to make the Angular side of things break by making this like color 2 instead, and look for a helpful error message telling you that you might be doing something wrong.
I'm also curious, does anybody already have, when they're doing full stack development, a setup that gives them type checking on both sides like this? One, just a couple, okay.
Yeah, 'cause the nice thing here is now we catch this at compile time. Usually something like this would be caught at runtime.
Yeah, and imagine you ever needed to change the API. It'd be really nice to be able to just rerun the tests, right? I know APIs are always stable. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Yes, question from the audience. Why is your protocol buffers thing failing to compile? Are you in the VM? Okay, so what should happen is, again, protocol buffers is in the Bazel world, which means that instead of getting a binary distribution, it gets built on your machine, which means that we're expecting to have a C++ compilation toolchain on your machine because all languages are in the big tent now. So I would expect there to be an error like the toolchain is not available. There's a file at the top called workspace, which is how Bazel knows how to find these other toolchains. I don't. Maybe Dan knows, or how do we get the toolchain for the protobuf in order to compile the protocol buffers? Sorry, I mean for the example, like how is it intended that you would compile protocol buffers? Or maybe you could just come over here and, yeah. Thank you, Dan, for doing most of the setup for this repo. Yay. Sorry, yeah, you can just, yeah. I don't know if anybody else has this problem. Is Dan's car really blue?
Oh, I forgot to ask.
Okay, he's busy.
Did anyone complete this? Did it work? Oh, yeah.
We're up to a handful.
Did you try to like change it back to something invalid so there was a mismatch, and you saw the error in the console?
So again, if you didn't see it, you can see it up here. Or better luck on better Wi-Fi later. And thank you to the conference Wi-Fi. I don't mean to, like we're abusing it pretty bad, I think. Yes? Where do the generated TypeScript typings go? So Bazel has this general philosophy not to put outputs in your sources. So there is a directory, and you can run Bazel info on the command line, and it will tell you all the places on your file system where it's doing things. So it has an output base, which is actually where it downloads the other tool chains, because they need to live on disk somewhere and has some caches. So if you run Bazel info, one of the keys there will be Bazel-bin, and that's the output directory. And I think actually in this example, there is a Bazel out folder right in the project, which is just a symlink into this other place. In some cases, we create the symlinks. In other cases, they kind of are more of a pain than they're worth because you need to exclude them from all of your tooling, or else your tools will go flowing into the output folder and get confused. Yeah, you can look in the bin folder, and there's a lot of intermediate artifacts that we produce on disk. If you, for example, let's say like there's a web test in this repo. It says I think it's broken on the VM right now, but you might be able to run it on your own machine. We generate a karma conf behind the scenes. You don't even see it. It goes in this bin folder. But it's really, if you need to debug the rules, it's actually very helpful that what we're doing is kind of like the Unix philosophy of we run a program, it produces some files, we take those files, we pass them to another program, because you can go look at those files and debug what happened. So yeah, the bin folder has all of these intermediate files as well as the final outputs. And one other thing, if you ask Bazel to build a certain thing, it will then in the output it will give you the path to the thing it just built. So it's not that you always have to go searching around the file system like I just said. It's only if you want to see intermediate. Right now we're just doing a run command, so there's no artifact that's being built so there's nothing printed that tells you where it is.
Okay.
All right, let's do
the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for the next one, we want to add something called an NX lib. This libs in NX, that's kind of like a signature feature of the NX product. It's a way to extract code out of your application into self-contained modules under a libs folder. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but we'll give you the command that you run. It's like using schematics under the hood to produce kind of a Bazel module, because once you run this command, you'll notice an extra file, and it's the build file that Alex talked about earlier. And part of this, since this right here is a little bit of a gap in our tooling, and we'll improve this later, but right now there's one extra step that you have to make, because when you create the lib, that becomes kind of like an orphaned Bazel module that isn't really picked up anywhere. It's not included anywhere. So you have to make a connection in the depths array. Like I think you mentioned that, right, Alex, about how to connect dependencies between Bazel modules, and that's what you do there. You take the address, kind of the address of that Bazel module that is that lib, and you register it with the app Bazel build file.
And at that point, you should be able, in the app, you should be able to import this Angular module and wire it up.
Yeah.
It's the last milestone because it's the biggest challenge. So don't worry, we will show you what it looks like. Let me make one other point while you're doing this. The way libs work in NX and also under Bazel is that they're a direct dependency. In other words, there's no packaging step that builds an NPM package that gets shipped to an artifact repository that has a version, and then you change a version, and then you download the thing. That would suck, because then if you make a change in the library, it wouldn't immediately show up in the app. Right? And everything we've shown you today is make any change, it's immediately visible in the app. So that's true for these libs as well. So they get compiled separately. Bazel will first compile the lib, then compile your app against the changes in the DTS files. And that may be a very different philosophy for how to do libraries than you're used to.
We should just be calling this command under the next Bazel example.
That's that.
Oh,
Actually,
so I think we need the full command, right? Because we didn't globally install ng.
oh yeah, sorry. That's
Let's
a
just-
good
can we
point
just edit
because
it here?
we didn't install NX and Angular CLI globally on this machine, so we need to refer to it by full path because you have those dependencies in your node modules. So instead of doing ng, do node modules /bin/ng because we don't have the local. We ran out of space on the VM. I think we resolved that at a later time, but at that point, we were too scared to touch it.
At about noon, we got enough space on
We
the
were
VM to
like-
do that.
We said no more changes to the VM. It works.
Yeah, so there's the updated command. You should be able to run ng with.
But like I said, if you have Angular CLI and NX globally installed, which is the recommended setup, you don't need the full path into it.
You could also just do it on the VM right now. You could just do npm install -g
Yeah, that too.
at angular/CLI. Should also work.
This guy pointed out, we also have an npm script that runs ng,
Oh.
so you can do npm run ng, and then the rest.
Okay. At this point, all of your knowledge of how to do node programming is coming into play because you have to look in the package JSON to see how to run the script that runs the other thing.
And I also recommend taking a look into the libs folder now after you run that command. Because if you're used to NX, you'll notice one additional file, which is the build Bazel file.
So if you're having trouble doing this locally, this would be a good time to look up here since we're going to run out of time soon. So this is the output from running that command. So it's generated this lib cars card. And then do you want to show how we wire it up?
Yeah, sure. So yeah. So we locate the build Bazel file in the target app for this lib, because and then you notice here we already have a dep wired up here, which is the kind of the proto object that we use for these cars. So you basically make another entry, and instead of API now, it's going to be libs. What did I call it? Cars, card, and then src. Notice we don't need to do the full. The path is shorter here because we have a convention. We name the Bazel rule the same as the folder, so we don't have to have. If you have more than one rule in there, you need to have like a colon and the name of the rule. But in this case, this build Bazel file has just a single external rule. And notice this now kicked off. Because if you were to make changes to the files on the car's card, you wouldn't notice any re-triggering of the build because Bazel is not aware of that. There are
Right.
TypeScript files there, but they're not part of the app as far as Bazel is concerned.
They weren't, but now they are.
Yeah, now
So
Bazel
now if we make a change to the cars card, it should like show up in the
Yeah.
well. So there's one more thing we didn't do, which is to actually use that component.
Yeah,
in
we
the
have to
app.
start using it inside of our, like the first step, like right now, it's just an empty ng module. You can fill in whatever functionality you want there, right? But there's one more point to make, and that is there's a slight change to how we import this lib now. If you're familiar with NX, you might remember using like an at, and like a symbolic path with at, whatever your org is or project, slash, whatever the feature is you're importing. We don't have that working at this point, so you have to use an absolute path. The good news is that you don't have to use a long relative path that dot slashes you back into libs, but for right now, we have to use an absolute path here.
Absolute to the root of the workspace, right? Not on
Yeah.
your machine, because this is something you could check in and share with your coworkers.
Right. So it's going to be cars, which is the name of the workspace, the Bazel workspace, slash libs, slash. You could, of course, barrel this up and shorten it. And like I said, this is a slight gap in our tooling. We'd like to make this experience better to kind of get rid of these like extra steps, because when you compare this to the default CLI/NX, you don't make this connection of build Bazel files, right? You don't have to worry about that, and you don't lose the nice symbolic at scope syntax, right? So this is now.
Question? Yes, if we had just made this import, the build would fail and say, I can't find any such module, and that's because it wasn't provided as an input when we ran the Angular compiler. At Google, we have a tool that you would write this import, and then our tool would say, oh, I know how to satisfy this import, and it would update the deps for you. And I have an intern, Jaren, hopefully is going to make that available for all of you also. It's going to be hard, so I wish both of us luck. But yeah, the way this is not yet the developer experience that we need in order to make Bazel under the CLI or under NX be the default, obviously. Too slow, too much setup, too many things to download, not ergonomic enough. So we're still working on it, that's why it's in labs. The important thing, obviously, is if you really have this problem today, and we use this at Google, so it's good enough for us, so it's not as ergonomic as the CLI, but it is usable if you have the problem and you need to start using it. Yeah.
So who's dependency for updating? So we install the parse card, and then we go under its build Bazel, and are we pointing at its own source?
No, sorry. In the app, we added an entry that points to the new module we created. So we created the cars card lib, and then we went to the app and added a dependency edge.
So in the Angular's build file?
Well, in the build file for our app. Yeah. OK, so we're almost out of time. Let's just look at the last slide. Yeah. So it's really awesome that you all came and tried this. I know the setup is rough and the code is rough. I hope you at least got a sense of why you want to have a build system across your full stack. Again, if you have the energy, check out Greg's talk at 5:30. Also, if you want to stop by the NG Hackathon, I have irresponsibly committed myself to writing a Bazel rule for Cypress IO, which I know nothing about. But it's, how hard could it be? So we can try hacking on some Bazel stuff. So come by there if you want to do more hacking, even if you want to just ask some questions about this demo we've been working on. And again, you can, the slides, and I'll post the video eventually to this Go link. And if you ran Bazel, you can come get a shirt. So I'm sorry, there's probably going to be a traffic jam, but we'll do our best to distribute them. Thank you.